When we say charge on, we commit to do extraordinary things. It's a catalyst for action. To put in the work. To keep trying. It's a challenge. To be smarter and stronger. Charge on. It drives us to be more. To get after it every day. It's time to rise above. To let them know we're coming. Charge on. Charge on.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Dean's Distinguished Lecture Series. I'm Dr. Robert Tico Crows, Associate Dean for Research and Administration at the Rosen College of Hospitality Management at the University of Central Florida. We honor Dr. Abraham Pizam, founding Dean of the Rosen College of Hospitality Management. 50 years ago, he achieved his Ph.D. defending his dissertation, Some Socio-Psychological Correlates of Innovation Within Industrial Suggestion Systems. The results of his dissertation prefaced his pioneering role in the field of hospitality and tourism research and education. His remarkable achievements made him an internationally renowned scholar. The Dean's Distinguished Lecture Series will take a look at the evolution of the hospitality and tourism industry through the eyes of some of the pioneers and doyens in the field of research and education. We are grateful to those acclaimed global scholars who already shared their insights during our lecture series in the past months. Dr. Jafar Jafari, Dr. Ari Reichel, Dr. Brian King, Dr. Anna Matilla, and Dr. Pauline Sheldon. The Dean's Distinguished Lecture Series will conclude in April this year. We hope we have another interesting lecture by our guest, Dr. Chris Ryan from the University of Waikato, New Zealand. Dr. Ryan will deliver his presentation entitled Tourism and Hospitality Research from Innovation to Commodification. Again, I would like to welcome you to this distinguished lecture series. And at this point, I would like to say good afternoon to my co-host, Dr. Alan Fayal, who will go over some household rules. Good afternoon, Alan.
Lovely, thank you, Tico, and welcome everybody, in particular a big welcome to Chris. It's always nice to welcome a fellow Brit and a true scholar. And I think for all those listening, one of my most memorable moments with Chris is an absolute gentleman when he rejects your papers. He does it in a way that is truly very friendly and supportive. So Chris, I appreciate those rejections over the years. But thank you very much for coming today. It's excellent for you to be with us. We've got a large crowd, so please, those in the audience, please put your questions in the Q&A function. And some warning, Chris, we have Brian Garrold, Peter Lugosi, and Rodri Thomas back in the UK, so I'm sure they will be itching to do some questions. But everybody, it's a wonderful presentation coming up, so thank you for joining us, and please put your questions in the Q&A function. And on that note, if I can pass to Dean Wong. Dean Wong.
Thank you, Tico. Thank you, Alan. Welcome, Chris. It's a great honor to host you here at the Rosen College. So this is an event the Rosen College is hosting, which is called the Dean's Distinguished Lecture Series, to honor our founding Dean, Abraham Pizam. I know that both of you are household names in the research community, but just for clarity and for consistency, I have a very short bio prepared for Abe. So Abe is the founding dean from 2000 to 2018 of the Rosen College of Hospitality Management at the University of Central Florida. Currently, he serves as the professor and the Linder Chapin Eminent Scholar Chair in Tourism Management. Professor Pizam is widely known in the field of hospitality and tourism management and has conducted research projects, lectured, and served as a consultant in more than 30 countries. He also held various academic positions throughout the world and has authored more than 250 publications, of which 180 of them were scientific publications, and also he published 10 books. So his publications have resulted in more than 20,000 citations with a H-index of 66. So for those of you who understand the H-index and the impact to measure your research. He's also the editor emeritus of the International Journal of Hospitality Management, one of the most premier journals in the field of hospitality, and serves on the editorial board of 26 academic journals. Professor Pizam has conducted consulting and research projects for a variety of international, national, and regional tourism organizations. So we are so grateful, as I mentioned at the beginning, that the speaker series today is supported by another great scholar in the tourism research community, Professor Chris Ryan from the University of Waikato, who is a friend of Abe. Chris, I have met you numerous times at conferences. I've listened to your speech many times, but every time it's so inspiring and encouraging. We do need to have inspirations from the pioneers like Chris and Abe, with many years of combined contribution to tourism research and education, who have really witnessed and experienced the entire history of tourism research, including the revolution, evolution, or including its ups and downs. So I can say from your title, it's from innovation to commodification. I'm not sure whether that is a positive approach or not so positive approach, facing especially the researchers of the next generation. So without further ado, so I would like to give the floor to Abe, who might be in a better position to describe Chris as a personal friend and colleague, of course. Right, Abe, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dean Wang. I appreciate the kind words. And it is with great pleasure and honor that I would like to introduce one of the pillars of the field of tourism management, a person who has rose to the top and is still on the top, and we all try to emulate him. When I was a young boy growing up in Israel, I came across the name of Chris Ryan. And I talked to my mother and I said, "Mommy, how can I ever be like Chris Ryan?" And my mother replied, "You can never be a Chris Ryan. He is unique and nobody can duplicate him." Now, of course, I'm joking about the story. Actually, I think I'm older than Chris, but I'm still looking up to him as a great scholar and even a mentor that one should, if one can, reproduce. So a word about memories. We are here talking about the past, and people of my age, and maybe even the age of Chris, remember the things a long time ago. But as my wife tells me on a regular basis, I can't remember what I had for lunch, but I do remember what happened more than 50 years ago. So without further introduction, I would like to pass on the baton, so to speak, to Chris, who would talk about the evolution of our field of study and maybe a little bit about our future. So Chris, the stage is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Abe, and thank you for all of those very kind words. I think you've built me up, so almost anything I now say will be an anticlimax. But anyway, thank you very much indeed. And thank you also to your colleagues for inviting me to address the group as a whole and those who are listening in. It's an honor and a privilege, and I'm sure my predecessors in this series have said the same thing, but it is, and because Abe, you have indeed been one of the founding fathers of hospitality research. And at that point, I suspect I should really now go into the presentation, and I will pull up the sharing of the screen, which hopefully should be coming up now. Okay, well, I was asked to nominate a subject and what we could think about. And of course, Abe and I have a long history. And I think history sometimes is instructive because we need to know where it is that we came from and how we got to where we are, and possibly have a look at where we are going to. And of course, just prior to this discussion, let me just minimize that. Just prior to the session starting, Abe and I were reminiscing, and it was indeed, I think, a golden period of being a professor. I obviously came from the United Kingdom, and when I started teaching, the world was very different to what it is today, and I was reminiscing that as an admissions tutor for our degree at the Nottingham Business School, we only had 40 places on the degree, and we had something like well over 3,000 applications through the centralized application system. And if we go back just to the 1950s, I think universities were really quite small by today's standards. I read a report on one of the educational reforms of that period, and they talked about only 56,000 university students in the UK. And even when I went to university, only about 7% of the 18 to 25 age group went to university. So they really were quite small, and everybody tended to know each other. And I think there was a period which probably began to end in the 1960s when, in fact, professors had enjoyed enormous prestige and also far less stress than today. We had no research assessment exercises, such as we have in the UK and Australia and New Zealand, where every 5 years, all of your research gets assessed. And universities tend to get very upset if their professors are not performing. And at that time, professors were also paid wages at levels akin to those of judges and members of parliament. And the senior common room was indeed a place for senior academics only. And I'm going to refer to the work of C.P. Snow and his book, The Two Cultures. C.P. Snow is an interesting person. He was actually a physicist. He was also a member of parliament for a time. He was also in the civil service. And of course, he was a professor at Cambridge. So his world embraced a wide range of experiences. As a novelist, he wrote a series of books called Strangers and Brothers, which were set in a Cambridge college. And reading that book, it seemed to me that at the time, professors just simply engaged in drinking port and having blue cheese and plotting and academic politics. Well, the academic politics certainly continue today, but I think the port and blue cheese a long time disappeared. He's famous for an article that he wrote originally in 1957, which was then published in, I think it was the New Statesman. And then in 1959, he was asked to give the Reed Lecture, which is an annual series of lectures that are supported by the BBC. And his theme was the two cultures. And this made quite a stir at the time because he was indicating, as I will indicate in a moment, that there was a broad division in academic life. And 50 years later, he was then asked to, again in 2009, they replayed this lecture, the Reed Lecture on the two cultures. So what was his primary thesis? He argued, and here I quote, I believe the intellectual life of the whole of Western society is increasingly being split into two polar groups. The literary intellectuals at one pole, at the other, scientists. And as the most representative, the physical scientists. Between the two, a gulf of mutual incomprehension, sometimes, particularly among the young, hostility and dislike, but most of all, a lack of understanding. So why would I take this? Well, I can remember in the 1960s when tourism and hospitality was just beginning in the United States and certainly in the United Kingdom. And there was, I felt at times that we were being disparaged by the senior academics in other fields. How could tourism, which is about fun, be a serious academic subject? I think we've got past that stage. But the question is, in tourism and hospitality research, are there two cultures? Or is there a merging of the two? What might be these two cultures? Is there a difference between tourism and hospitality? Certainly Abe, to his credit, has always argued that in fact hospitality is very much about the hotel industry and how it provides services and how it satisfies the guests for the hotels. Whereas, of course, we know that he tends to disagree or perhaps overstresses the situation. But Conrad Lashley, on the other hand, talks about hospitality as having a history of guest, and he takes a somewhat different view. So we have splits even within our own fields. And of course, there's that famous article by, his name now slips my mind. I'm having my Joe Biden brain fade moment, where where tourism is seen as either it's a sociological phenomenon or it's an industry. And therefore there is a divide in the types of research that occur within our own fields. Or is there in fact a merger of the two? And I will argue that there is a coming together of those two elements. But what then have the factors that have generated this divide? What are the impacts of this divide? And are there in fact new types of divides? Alan referred to the fact that I was editor of tourism management for 25 years. Alan, by the way, I should say that in getting your letter of rejection, you were a member of the majority. So you can feel satisfied on that set. What I do see is a difference in light between the research which is emanating from Asia and certainly a strong European tradition. Now, Chinese, Japanese, Taiwanese, and other colleagues from other parts of Asia seem very much dictate or be in a field of post-positivistic empiricism, and formulae are scattered across the pages. But we also have another issue, I think, today. Are universities falling into the traps of what I called lazy empiricism forced upon them by the government policies, which produce things like research assessment exercises and the search to and the attempts to get published in what are called the top journals as measured by metrics which are contestable. Digression. Let me ask 3 questions. If a bat and a ball costs $1.10 and the bat costs $1 more than the ball, how much does the ball cost? Secondly, if you're in a race and you pass the person who's second, what position do you now occupy? And thirdly, if a lake fills with water and doubles the amount of water each day and tomorrow, on the 48th day, the lake is full, how long did it take for the lake to get half full? So you see the questions, you probably arrived at your answers comparatively quickly. What has this to do with my topic? Well, the answer lies in the fact that some of you may have got some of those questions wrong. What research has shown by Daniel Carman is that 50% of people would say that the bat costs $1. At least 1/3 of the people say that by passing the person who's in second, you are now in first place. You're obviously in second place. And apparently about 40% reply in answer to the third question that it takes 24 days. It's actually 47. So is intuitive thinking less valid? Are we lacking mathematical skills? And if we lack mathematical skills, does that leave us only with intuitive thinking? And if the world lacks logic, then is faulty intuitive thinking the way to progress? The reason why I raise these issues is that, first of all, in New Zealand, we are having an examination of what is happening in our schools. As you know, there are international comparisons of school children's performance. In New Zealand, for a long time, used to be around about fourth in these assessments. We're now down to somewhere between 12 and 15, depending on the subject matter. We are having problems in maths teaching. Schools are finding difficulties to get maths teachers. We are also having some problems in reading. Why does all of this matter? Are we in fact moving, as some people have argued, into a world where in fact logic and scientific thinking is not being accepted by growing proportions of the population? These questions came from Daniel Kahneman, who was the 2002 Nobel Prize winner in economics for his work in heuristics and biases. He argues that in fact academics, oh, by the way, this was his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. It does show that academics can write books that actually achieve high positions in the New York lists of best-selling books. So Kahneman contrasted two modes of thinking, and now I'm back to my two cultures. C.P. Snow was really questioning ignorance. Ignorance by both sides of the field. The humanitarian thinkers that were initially perhaps brought up in a Victorian pattern as idolized or as characterized by Matthew Arnold, or the new sciences as he himself represented as a physicist. One prizes, if you like, a more holistic, humanistic way of looking at the human being. The other tends to think in terms of looking at the evidence of being positivistic, objective, using mathematical testing. Kahneman contrasted these two sides of thinking, the fast and the intuitive. And what he was showing was how, in fact, our brains often misled us. I've just finished marking 66 student essays, and I keep saying to them, do please try and complete your essay 24 hours before you submit, and proofread it and check it, and let the day go by before you submit and reread it, because your brain will have fooled you. You have not written what you think you have written. And I think this process is continuing at all sorts of levels. So what has all this got to do with tourism and hospitality research? Is it a question of intuitive or logical thinking that is at the basis of these sorts of divides between, on the one hand, those who see tourism as a sociological phenomenon and those who really are seeking to support contentions, develop conceptualizations through empirical methods? What Kahneman talked about was he said that intuitive thinking might be a form of latent logic. This was very much the line of argument that was taken by Musavi and her co-author, because they had studied the way in which decisions are taken by the senior executives of companies. And many of them did depend upon gut reactions. In other words, what might be arguably be a form of irrational thinking. What they pointed to is that, in fact, leaders are often required to make decisions in uncertain situations where there has been no prior proof. And therefore, they do tend to this more intuitive pattern of thought. Now, that's made me think about our own history of tourism and hospitality. And I actually argue that we can divide our process or the progress of our subject into various stages. And when I think about a number of the seminal works, I've just had an article that's gone through a review, and the reviewer said many of your references are rather old. Well, I'm rather old too, I guess. But when I think about the early people in our field, Veblen's theory of the leisure class in 1899, Daniel Borstein's work on the pseudo event, the French geographer Meyerset's theory of the changing peripheral, which in some ways predated Dick Butler's 1980 article in Canadian Geographer on tourist area life cycle. Sir George Young's book, Tourism, Blessing or Blight, which really put through the whole issue of whether tourism is an economic benefit is more than offset by the degradation of environments and even social degradation as well. Graham Dan's work on push and pull, you can see through a whole list. Peter Murphy's work on tourism, a community approach, and I would even include the late John Urie's book, The Tourist Gaze. These books were primarily based, or were motivated by the curiosity of the researcher and based on observation and description. And there are many of the other papers by Alistair Morrison, Seko Asarohola, Don Getz, and they've all become seminal papers. And the commonality between all of these works, or most of these works, are there's no formula, no statistical formula. There's no test of statistical reliability. It does seem to represent perhaps a different world to what we are seeing in our major journal articles today, where as you turn each page, as I say, there are table statistics, statistical justifications. Our past was perhaps driven by a broadly sociological human geographical perspective, and it still influences our thinking. And these are very much the sorts of things that we certainly are teaching at our undergraduate level. But then the world began to change, and I think much of this change was due to the fact that we began to get powerful computing facilities. Now, there were some exceptions to what I've been saying. For example, the journal Travel Research in 1978 published an article which had, by the day standards of those days, a very large sample, 1,626 residents. And there were statistics in it, ordinary least squares regression. And that article was in fact written by some young academic at the time called Abraham Bazan. Abe, you beat us all to it yet again. I can remember doing my own PhD, and I used SPSS and the IBM XT, and it had some 20, and SPSS at that time was on 25 5.25-inch floppy disks. Today, we have so much increased accessibility to statistical packages. We've seen now increasingly concerns about whether our samples are large enough and how we test for our samples. And as the editor for tourism management, I began to try and get people to try and justify much more rigorously why they thought their sample size was appropriate. We've seen the emergence of structural equation modeling. We begin to become very concerned that we should be testing the relationships between variables. Forecasting for a long time was based on ARIMA, now we're into SARIMA and all sorts of other techniques. We take care as researchers to prove what our alpha coefficients, our KMOs, our CRs, whether or not we are suffering, our data suffers from multicollinearity and autocorrelation. New journals are far more numerous. For a long time as tourism and hospitality researchers, we only had 3 SSCI journals. The number of journals has increased, and for that we must in part indicate that there's a symbiotic relationship between publishers and researchers. And it was a British businessman who realized this and began to create Pergamon Press and start more publishing, because he saw it as a way that researchers were wanting to better disseminate their research, but at the same time, he wanted to make money from publishing. And that tension has underlined some of the recent discussions that we've had about the powers of the large publishers. What we've moved into is a position of the far greater dissemination through journals and far greater sophistication of the software. And I do wonder whether, in fact, we are in some dangers. As a member of the International Academy for the Science of Tourism, I remember Eric Cohen, one of the founders, of course, of our field, one of the writers of many of those seminal papers based on observation and description, put in a letter to us all as members of the Academy expressing his concern that the subject of tourism and hospitality was being overtaken by the technocrats. Tourism is about people. It is about the way in which we experience new places, new things, which give us cause to think. In part of my personal history, I was a windsurfing instructor, and I saw people come on holiday and literally have those cathartic moments, which of course Eugenia Wickens talks about in her work, drawing upon the Shirley Valentine syndrome, where people have a holiday which can literally change their lives because it's a time of reflection and a time of thinking. And yet we have used things like NVivo and QDA minor. We see all of these things being subjected to greater technical analysis. And yet, these tools are also helping us to bridge the culture between, if you like, the qualitative researcher and the quantitative researcher. Software like Lexamancer, QDA minor are able to produce statistics from the text, and they help shape our thinking in more structured patterns. Equally, we're beginning to see John Creswell's work on the pragmatic paradigm, and we can do far better analysis. We can remember perhaps the concerns that were being expressed over the by Cambridge Analytica and the influences that they have upon the political process by allowing politicians in lead up to elections to better target their messages. I was teaching a course on research methods at Waikato, and I showed them using QDA minor, how in fact that software links up mapping with in fact the text that is derived from things such as Facebook. And my students were literally blown away. They had not realized what could actually be done. And all of these things are now becoming even more sophisticated because we can have the off-the-shelf software, and we can now incorporate into those packages routines that we can program for ourselves using things like Python and R. We are indeed moving to a stage where we can merge the quantitative and the qualitative analysis in ways which were not possible in the past. I've mentioned John Creswell. John has argued we should engage in mixed methods, and our research should be driven by the research problem rather than a research paradigm. The concepts of research paradigms go back into the 19th century with Hegel's dialectic, where he talked about thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. John Creswell says we should try and draw the benefits of both whatever paradigms we are using. Use of textual analysis software enables us to do this, but I still do have concerns. I have concerns that perhaps we are trying to impose upon qualitative researchers who come from different paradigms of constructionism and interpretivism, a system which is based on logic and post-positivism. Can we really merge these paradigms together? Well, John would argue, yes, you can, because you can do it through adopting a pragmatic approach. Our research is dictated to by all sorts of influences. It's not only by our own curiosity and what we want to do and the way in which we analyze data, it's also, we work within universities, and universities are no longer the places that they were 50 years ago, as I was describing at the outset of this presentation. Universities are perhaps beginning to behave like corporations, and the management perhaps is based on gut feeling. When I started research, perhaps I was naive and idealistic. My research was driven by my own curiosity, and increasingly then by a realization that we do have responsibilities, and our research should be driven by an attempt to better the human condition and possibly the natural world. But today, universities prize research for the publicity that the university can gain, for the improvements in QS standings, and the lesson for young scholars is they should indeed publish, or they will indeed perish. And for the older scholar, publish and get research money. And these lessons apply to tourism and hospitality. And I do wonder, does pragmatism contain vision? What happens to the out of the square thinking if we engage in these sorts of processes? I think research assessment exercises recognize the flows of conventional citation metrics. So now we're being asked under our research assessment exercises, what's your impact? And the impact is not measured as much as in the past by your citation indices or the impact factor of the journals in which you publish, but are you shaping decision makers by our political and industry leaders? But disruption exists, and disruption is coming to us through the Internet of Things. We're on the verge of 5G, and this will see a different world and a different way of viewing things. There are advances in artificial intelligence. I've got a young colleague who's now writing articles using swarm hypotheses. I have to admit, when I got such articles as editor of tourism management, I began to think, I'm getting past it. Our research becomes increasingly technical and complex, but does it retain the quality of understandability? And this is another twin cultures or two cultures in our publications. We're told industry doesn't understand what it is that we are writing. I say if you're a good researcher, you can in fact write for two audiences. You write for the academic audience, and then, as I have done in the past, I then write for the trade press. But young academics are being pushed into a position where they see research as a path for promotion, not for the contribution that it makes to the well-being of the wider society. And now I'm beginning to see universities encourage doctoral degrees with publication because it aids the research metrics. I see problems increasingly existing for those who are wanting to secure promotion if they are teaching orientated. I like to encourage my doctoral students to immerse themselves into the societies of which they are researching. I encourage them to go and live in a small Chinese village. I encourage them to, if they're in the industry side, to try and work alongside in those industry settings. We do see attempts at creating what Pauline Sheldon was talking about, a new form of tourism. The mantra is small is beautiful that Schumpeter came up with may indeed still be a way of forward to the future. But as Brian Wheeler pointed out, the problems for mass tourism don't lie in just going small. There are so many issues, and that's why also we have an increasing drive towards transparency. We have guidelines that are given by COPE and Equator. Equator is much more in the medical sciences, but do look at their webpage because they make some very good observations about what constitutes good research. So what about the future? How can we progress into the future with all of these things that are surrounding us? I think we do have to give young academics breathing space. And we must stop telling them only the top SSCI journals. Seems to me a very unfair burden to place upon a young doctoral student at the start of their career to tell them they must publish in a top SSCI journal when they haven't got, as Abe and I have, some 50 years of experience, and I still find it difficult to get published in top journals. So what is it like at the beginning of your career? I do think replication studies have a value, because if everything is changing, it is useful to know that what worked in 1960, 1970, 1980 is still working in 2020. But above all, I would encourage researchers to come out from behind their computers, give appointments to people who immerse themselves into the lives of their respondents. Tourism is about people. In New Zealand, Maori have a very common saying, tangata, tangata I tangata. People, people, always people. And work with the industry and work with communities. We do have lots of good examples out there. The United Nations Millennium Goals have become the Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, the UNWTO has recognized that this gives far more opportunity to us as researchers to work in a way which does actually benefit the communities. I'm a great supporter of the UNWTO's International Network of Sustainable Tourism Observatories programs, because this, for me at least, gives me an opportunity to work with the industry and with a local community, and it gives opportunities for my students to also work with those communities. But we are living in a rapidly changing world, and we're on the cusp of 5G. And I think when 5G does really become common, our world will indeed be much different. And we have many colleagues who are talking about smart cities. So I think we have a lot of change. I've tried to give us a historical perspective in approximately 30 minutes. So thank you very much for listening. And I now pass it back to Alan to chair this session. So thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed, Chris. Great food for thought in there. And Chris, one question that was sort of bugging me throughout, and it's something that I think is increasingly difficult for those of us that do want to be, or think back to the John Urries of this world, where we're very curious, where we've got a very conceptual paper. It's increasingly difficult getting those sort of papers through the system, because I think so many people are now in that empirical world. Have you got any advice for sort of younger scholars who've really got these ideas, but the publication world has sort of gone against them a little bit?
Well, I think this is an issue really for editors and editorial boards, and also for the types of journals that we have. That's why the new journal that I now edit, Tourism Critiques, Practice and Theory, because I think we need to have journals rather like tourist studies that who engage in attracting or wanting to attract these forms. Historically, and of course, Annals of Tourism research has long tried to adopt this approach. Editors are gatekeepers, but I saw my role as not being really closing the gate, but trying to open the gate for researchers and to try to accept different forms of publication. For the young researcher who's got the concept, well, I guess part of the research is then researching the journals. And yes, our top journals are increasingly, if we take JTR and tourism management, dominated, I think, by the empiricist, statistical, post-positivistic type of thinking, particularly as we see, I think, many of our Asian colleagues being in that approach. And again, for Chinese colleagues, China, one of the things that Mao Zedong pushed was actually to be more scientific. And we have Xi Jinping citing with approval some of the comments of Mao Zedong and talking about the need to be scientific. Then we can dispute what we mean by scientific. And I can remember being on a panel with Sean Zhang, and Sean was arguing our research must be scientific, to which I commented is not qualitative research scientific. He rather ducked the response. So I think it's not left, it shouldn't be left to the individual researcher. And I think we should perhaps be challenging editors. But I can remember Rick Perdue saying to me, he wanted to publish more qualitative research, but he said, one of the problems is qualitative researchers are their own worst enemy because they're always so critical of somebody else's research. And it's easier to judge a piece of quantitative research because if it follows the conventions and you can show you got the right KMO and the CR and the RMSEA is right, then the research is good. Qualitative researchers ought to remember perhaps that their own viewpoint is not the only viewpoint.
Okay. And if I just raise one other issue, then I can see Abe itching to get in here. Chris, one of the joys of working in the US is there's no research assessment exercise.
You are very lucky, but you do have to get your tenure, and increasingly tenure is being driven by the impact factor of the journals. But it's still a breath of fresh air.
To what extent do you think the assessment exercises themselves have actually contributed to the challenge?
Significantly, I think has to be the answer. And it's a disease which has spread into Asia because young scholars there in the Chinese system, if you get your doctoral degree, you have to also get 3 research points, which you get through publication. And you get 3 research points if you publish in an SSCI journal. I think there is an attempt by the British, the Australian and the New Zealand authorities to realize that this has been a trap. And they've then tried to switch it towards, well, what impact does your research have? But the universities themselves and university administrators are still trapped into this syndrome of getting high SSCI publications because they are trapped by the QS ratings, and QS rating and the Shanghai ratings do emphasize these types of work. So we need voices which are saying, hold on, this is not the only paradigm. So Alan, you made a good move from Bournemouth.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a question. This is from Febzi, but I think it's a perfect cue for Abe to come in as well. Febzi, thanks very much for coming, Chris, and everything. So where do you see the boundary line between tourism and hospitality research? So clearly there's a cue for Abe to jump in here as well, but Chris at first.
Much depends upon the focus of the individual researcher. I drew a distinction between Abe's work and Conrad Lashley's work, and Conrad Lashley used to say in his perspective and what he's argued about hospitality moves hospitality into a more sociological setting, which then takes us into questions of who is the guest and what form of accommodation is being present. If I think of something like Airbnb, where does Airbnb stand in the research? Is it a subset of hospitality research, where you can be talking about the impact on hotels, occupancy rates, on the rates that hotels are charging, because it represents a new form of competition? Or is Airbnb a function of changing economics, the role of houses and property prices, or is it indeed a sociological function as to where people want to meet others, make some money on the side, but they do it as much motivated by interest in people and having interesting conversations around the breakfast table? So I think it's the researcher that then dictates whether in fact it's a conventional hospitality subject about rates and about service and about impacts on the wider hotel and accommodation sector, or is it in fact a more sociologically orientated subject? So I don't think it falls clearly, there isn't a clear distinction. And that's true of most of the things we study. Our boundaries of definition are also porous in that they open themselves, and bounded borders are points of discussion and joining as much as points of difference. So Abe, Abe wants a comment.
Yeah. My particular problem with the issue of research is the purpose of research. When I was a young man, I was trained and educated that the purpose of research is to solve problems, whether they are societal problems, environmental problems, physical problems, but all problems. We have forgotten over the years what the purpose of research is. Today, and maybe in the last few decades, the purpose of research is to generate publications and to get promotion and tenure. To speak, we are speaking with each other, with other researchers, rather than we're trying to find solutions to problems, societal problems, environmental problems, and so forth. We live in a bubble. Our journals are never read by anybody else except those who are academics in that field. We're not addressing the real problems that practitioners face on a daily basis. So we have shifted completely the purpose of research from a noble solving problems to a means to advance one's agenda. And personally, maybe it's a function of my age and my stage of life, I am quite upset about that. Because why do we have 400 and plus journals that deal with minute problems that do not address either industry or societal issues? Maybe it's coming of age for me and the field, but I'm not particularly exciting. Again, when I was a young man, there was such a thing as action research. Today, you hardly hear the term action research, and publications are not geared towards that subject matter.
Well, I share your concern, but I think there are ways around it. I pointed out, for example, the UNWTO's initiative for sustainable tourism observatories, and that is one way in which we engage with our local communities and with the local administrations, the political administrations, and indeed with members of the communities themselves. And a lot of the work that we do, I know, is not suited for publication, but that's one of the roles of the university. The university is there to serve the wider community. And I think many of us attempt to do that in various ways. And certainly it's, we are perhaps animals that divide ourselves. There is our professional research side, but equally we are out talking. I mean, I sit on the Regional Tourism Organisation Advisory Board. I was attending a meeting only last week. And I know for many of my own colleagues in their different fields, they too are all working with industries. Yesterday I was talking to one of my young colleagues, and she's gone and volunteered to do front of house service in one of our hotels in Hamilton, so that she can keep in touch with the reality of the staff and the experiences that they are facing, and with the operations of the university, of the hotel. And it's up to us, if you like, within our own universities to encourage this sort of thing.
Can I jump in there, Chris?
I had the experience when I was interviewing somebody for a post. He had an impressive list of publications, but it very quickly turned out that in fact he never actually gathered any of the data himself. It was all, he had students who wanted to collect the data. His life was sitting behind a computer conducting statistical analyses. We did not appoint that person. But that is a mindset that I fear I see in many of our Asian colleagues.
Can I jump in there, Chris Hannay, because there's really a good question here from Rodri Thomas, who you both know very well. Roger asks, is the growing need to demonstrate wider relevance and impact perhaps something that will sustain our field if we rise to the challenge?
Well, certainly here in the post-COVID, well, of course, in New Zealand, we've not really suffered too badly, but our tourism industry has suffered. Not so much in my part of the North Island of New Zealand, but in South Island, which was very dependent upon the international tourists. There are businesses that are now no longer existing because of the lack of the international visitor. What COVID has very clearly shown is just how important tourism is as an industry. And how important it is for sustaining the lifestyles of small communities. And therefore, I would agree with Rodri that being able to show relevance in a political, economic, and social sphere has become very clear as a result of COVID. So I would agree with this comment.
Yeah. I make a quick comment. Thank you very much, Chris, for your comments. Some of them, of course, really made us to really think about the future of research in our field, whether it's tourism or whether it's hospitality. Maybe we can debate about, for another 10, 20 years about distinction between the two. But I think, we have to go back to the root question. That is, what is the purpose of doing research? The question, asked by Abe, right? So years ago, I still remember the debate about, purpose of education. And I think, it is a consensus of a large group of people that, the purpose for education, we should treat education as a social enterprise, right? So we are not providing education just for the pragmatic purposes of, helping people to find a job, okay? I think, the same logic probably will be applied to research. Research should be treated as a social enterprise. That is that, can we put ourselves in a position to solve problems, to help our stakeholders, especially in our case, industry stakeholders, to solve problems, right? So that should be the driving factor. But also, I think the challenge is that as institutions of higher learning, just like any kinds of institution, when the assessment kicks in, and then it will pose different sets of challenges, right? Because I can argue for assessment enterprises implemented in UK, for example, in Australia, right? On one hand, and then on the other hand, people will say, well, we don't want to have any assessment matrix, implemented or enforced, because who is to judge the quality of my research? I still believe that I'm doing greatest things, possibly I can do, right? I'm creating impact, right? So I think the challenge is that how do we implement the the performance aspect of a particular institution or organization, which is composed of individual members being contributors to that institution, right? So I think that is the challenge, right? So all these metrics, they should be treated as references and guidelines. But unfortunately, in many of the societal systems, they are treated as rigid, matrix, as if that you have either this or you either have or you either do not have. Okay, so I think that is the danger. If you go through that path, and then our research will be really measured by just a number, right? It's really not about the impact to the society, the impact on policy formulation, and so on and so forth. So I think that is the challenge actually.
Well, yes, and I think we're in agreement. But what I'm arguing is, well, first of all, we ask why is this assessment coming to the fore, and one of it it's perhaps an unintended consequence of government's drive to extend participation in universities. That in a growing technological age, each government has argued we need technologically trained people, people who are also able to think in an innovative manner, and that is the function of the university. Therefore, they increased universities. But if you remember what I began by saying, is universities were comparatively small institutions where in fact one knew one students extremely well and they knew you and you could drive them and they could not hide and they had to in fact perform. And indeed they actually had to perform at an earlier stage in their school career in order to get into university. Governments, when they began to set targets like 50% of their young people should go to university, could not afford that model. Therefore, universities became mass education institutions, and they are arguably not sufficiently funded. Therefore, they begin to think more like a corporate in terms of how much money is coming into the institution, what prestige does a university have, and it drives you then, and governments are then, as in the UK, which has got about, I don't know how many universities now, when I left it was about 60 or so, there are more today. Australia and New Zealand, governments are saying, how do we divide the money between the competing universities? And that again is a false argument in that it senses that universities compete. Well, we only compete because we have to get the money. It's a circular type of argument. That's why I think it's the universities and the researchers themselves who have to break out of this syndrome by doing things of working with communities and realizing that not all of their research is going to lead to a publication. But it's easy for me to do that because at my age, in my position, I don't have to keep looking over my shoulder, although I do every 5 years to have my research assessed. And the peculiarity of the New Zealand situation is that individual researchers are assessed, not just research groupings. But it's for us to, as I say, to link with industry, to link with communities. But if I was 25 and not 75, then I would be thinking, I need to get a job. And I can only get a job if I've got my doctoral degree and I've got at least 3 publications and I've got teaching experience. When I joined the university, not all of our staff had PhDs, and some of our most eminent researchers did not have PhDs. The world has changed. And I, as a doctoral supervisor, would be failing my students if I didn't say to them, I'm sorry, we've actually got to publish. You won't get a job. And by the way, you should be doing some teaching as well. Otherwise, they don't have a career. Those are the harsh realities. Even now, it may be what I've also suggested, perhaps, that university, much of what we are teaching at universities at undergraduate level has been known for at least 30 or 40 years. And if you're in the field of mathematics, you might get up to about the 1930s. If universities are research institutions, then perhaps we should push up all undergraduate work to the polytechnics.
I would like to chime in at this point with 2 concluding remarks. First, thanking Chris for this very insightful presentation. One remark that I gather from your presentation and also from the following conversation is whether our performance are being measured by the way we characterize or define problems. If we define problems as technical problems, like for example, I just read a book of Harari where death is defined in terms of a technical problem. So you can solve that by technical problems. So that's why people think in terms of immortality. Or is it that our reward system has changed in such a way that universities on themselves, or even the whole publishing world, cannot resolve them without engaging in a societal collective process in order to look back at how we have to define our reward system in order to go to a more societal approach to problems. So those are the 2 remarks that I want to make at the end of this presentation. And I would like again to thank Dr. Chris Ryan for his interesting and engaging presentation. And we will see each other again at our next Abraham Pizam Distinguished Lecture Series, on April 21st at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time, which is New York time, with our guest speaker, Dr. Joseph Mazenak, professor at Modul University in Vienna. Thank you very much, and please stay safe until the next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
Chris.
you, Chris.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Excellent.
Bye.
Bye.